Sometimes the desert teaches you lessons you never expected to learn. My name is Janet Adams, and I'm 73 years old. For most of my life, I believed that family meant everything, that the people who share your DNA would never truly abandon you when it mattered most. I spent decades building my world around my children, sacrificing my own dreams and desires to ensure their success, their happiness, their security. I thought that devotion would be returned when I needed it most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was wrong. What happened to me in Death Valley 3 months ago changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong somewhere. This isn't just a story about being left behind at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. This is about discovering that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you die for, and sometimes the people who save you are complete strangers who owe you nothing. The morning everything changed started like any other day of our cross-country road trip. I remember thinking how blessed I felt, sitting in the passenger seat of my son Michael's SUV, watching the vast expanse of desert landscape roll past the windows. Behind me, my daughter-in-law Sarah was trying to keep their twins entertained with tablet games, while my daughter Lisa and her husband Greg followed in their own car with their teenage son Brandon. 3 generations of the Adams family, finally taking the vacation I'd been planning and saving for over 2 years. I'd insisted on this trip. Maybe insisted is too gentle a word. I'd pushed for it, planned every detail, booked every hotel room, and yes, I'd paid for everything. At 73, I wasn't getting any younger, and I wanted to create memories with my family while I still could. I wanted to show them the country I'd fallen in love with during my youth, back when Harold and I used to take road trips before. The children came along, before life got complicated, before cancer took him from me 5 years ago. We'd been on the road for 8 days, starting from our home in Ohio and making our way toward California. The plan was to spend a few days in Los Angeles before flying back home together. I'd arranged everything, down to the return flights. I was proud of how well it was all going, despite the occasional tension that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface whenever we stopped for meals or gathered in hotel rooms. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to those tensions. I should have noticed how often Michael and Sarah would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't watching. I should have wondered why Lisa seemed so eager to drive separately instead of all piling into the larger vehicle. I should have questioned why everyone's phone conversations seemed to stop the moment I entered a room. But I was too caught up in my own happiness to see the warning signs. After years of feeling like a burden since Harold's death, after months of sensing that my weekly phone calls to my children were more obligation than pleasure, I finally felt needed again. Wanted. Important. The morning of our 10th day brought us into the heart of Death Valley. I'd been looking forward to this part of the journey more than any other. Harold and I had honeymooned here in 1972, staying at a little motor lodge that probably doesn't exist anymore. I wanted to share that magic with my family, to show them the raw beauty of this unforgiving landscape that had captivated me as a young bride. "Mom, are you sure we need to stop at every scenic overlook?" Michael had asked as I directed him to pull over at Zabriskie Point. His voice carried that particular tone I'd grown accustomed to over the years, the one that suggested I was being too demanding, too controlling, too much. "Just a few pictures, sweetheart," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice light. "When will we ever be here again?" Sarah sighed audibly from the back seat. "The kids are getting cranky, Janet. We've been in the car for hours." I bit back my response. The children weren't cranky. They were glued to their devices and hadn't looked up at the stunning landscape even once. But I'd learned over the years that commenting on my grandchildren's behavior was a sure way to create conflict with Sarah. She was protective of her parenting choices in a way that made me feel like every observation was seen as criticism. We took the pictures, though no one seemed particularly enthusiastic about it. I posed between Michael and Lisa, forcing smiles that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. Brandon remained in the car, claiming he felt carsick, while the twins complained about the heat the entire time. I tried to tell them about the geological history of the area, about how these badlands were formed over millions of years. But I could see their attention drifting. By the time we got back on the road, the atmosphere in the car had grown heavier. I suggested we stop for lunch in Furnace Creek, but Michael said he wanted to push through to our hotel in Ridgecrest. Lisa called from the other car to say they were running low on gas and needed to stop soon. That's when Michael spotted the small gas station ahead, a lonely outpost in the endless desert landscape. "Thank God," Sarah muttered. "I need to stretch my legs." The gas station was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in the middle of Death Valley. Small, weathered, with that timeless quality that made it impossible to tell if it had been there for 20 years or 50. A hand-painted sign advertised "Last gas for 50 miles" in faded red letters. There were only 2 pumps, both looking like they'd seen better decades, and a small convenience store with windows so dusty you could barely see inside. Michael pulled up to the first pump, while Lisa and Greg took the second one. I watched as everyone began the familiar routine of a road trip gas stop. The men handled the fuel while the women gathered the children and headed toward the restroom. I sat for a moment, enjoying the brief respite from the road noise and the subtle family tensions that had been building all morning. "I'm going to pay inside and use the ladies' room," I announced, gathering my purse and the receipt Michael handed me. "We'll get the kids settled and organize some snacks," Sarah said, ushering the twins toward the store entrance. I remember feeling grateful for her taking charge of the practical details. Despite our occasional friction, Sarah was good at managing logistics, and I appreciated not having to worry about every small decision for once. This was supposed to be a vacation for me too, after all. The interior of the gas station was exactly what I expected. Narrow aisles packed with overpriced snacks, energy drinks, and road trip necessities. The air conditioning was working overtime, against the desert heat, creating a sharp contrast with the scorching temperature outside. An elderly man sat behind the counter, his weathered face speaking of decades spent in this unforgiving landscape. He looked up when I entered, offering the kind of genuine smile you don't often see in busy city establishments. "Afternoon, ma'am. Hot one today, isn't it?" "Certainly is," I replied, approaching the counter with our gas receipts. "Though I have to say, there's something beautiful about this harsh landscape. My late husband and I used to travel through here years ago." His smile widened. "Death Valley gets in your blood, doesn't it? I've been running this place for 32 years, and I still look forward to the sunrise every morning. Where are you folks headed?" "California. Los Angeles eventually. I'm traveling with my family." I gestured toward the windows, expecting to see the familiar sight of our 2 vehicles and my loved ones preparing for the next leg of our journey. The parking area was empty. I stared at the vacant space where our cars had been parked just minutes before, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gas pump stood alone in the desert heat, no trace of the SUV or sedan that had brought me here. "Excuse me," I said to the attendant, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Did you see the 2 cars that were here? A blue SUV and a silver sedan?" He looked up from his paperwork, following my gaze to the empty lot. "Oh, those folks? They pulled out maybe 5 minutes ago. Seemed to be in quite a hurry." The words hit me like a physical blow. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, as I tried to call Michael's number. No signal. Of course there was no signal. We were in the middle of Death Valley, miles from the nearest cell tower. "They must have thought I was already in one of the cars," I said aloud, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how unlikely that sounded. I'd announced where I was going. Sarah had acknowledged my plans. How could 6 adults and 3 children all assume I was somewhere else? The gas station attendant was watching me with growing concern. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" I tried Michael's number again, holding my phone toward the windows in desperate hope of catching a signal. Nothing. The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in. I was stranded in Death Valley with nothing but the contents of my purse, while my family drove away without me. "They'll realize their mistake and come back," I said, as much to convince myself as to explain the situation to this stranger. "They have to come back." But even as I spoke, doubt was creeping in. How far would they drive before someone noticed I wasn't in either car? Would they notice at all? Or would they each assume I was with the other group? And if they did realize, how long would it take them to drive back through the desert to find me? The attendant, who introduced himself as Frank, offered me a chair behind the counter and a bottle of water from his personal cooler. "No charge," he said when I tried to pay. "You look like you could use it." I accepted his kindness gratefully, sinking into the worn plastic chair as the full weight of my situation settled over me. The gas station fell quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rumble of a truck passing on the distant highway. Frank went about his duties, occasionally glancing my way with concern, but giving me space to process what had happened. As the first hour passed, I found myself replaying every moment from the morning, searching for clues I might have missed. Had there been signs that something like this was planned? Were the hushed conversations and exchanged glances more significant than I'd realized? The rational part of my mind insisted this had to be an accident, a terrible miscommunication that would be resolved as soon as my family realized their mistake. But there was another voice in my head, quieter but more persistent, that whispered, "Darker possibilities." This voice reminded me of the way Sarah's jaw tightened whenever I made suggestions about our itinerary. It recalled Michael's increasing impatience with my stories and observations. It noted how Lisa had been unusually quiet during our family dinners, how she'd seemed almost relieved when we'd decided to travel in separate cars. "They'll be back," I told Frank when he offered me another bottle of water. "They have to be back." Frank nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He'd probably seen enough stranded travelers over the years to know that family dynamics could be more complicated than they appeared on the surface. "How long you been on the road together?" he asked gently. 10 days. We started in Ohio. This was supposed to be a bonding trip, a chance for 3 generations to make memories together. I laughed, but it came out bitter. I planned every detail, booked every hotel room. I wanted it to be perfect. "Family trips can be challenging," Frank said diplomatically. "Lot of personalities in close quarters." I found myself opening up to this stranger in ways I hadn't anticipated. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the growing realization that I might be here longer than I'd hoped. But I began telling Frank about my family, about Harold's death 5 years ago, and how it had changed everything. About the loneliness of widowhood and the desperate need to feel connected to my children and grandchildren. About the growing sense that I was becoming more burden than blessing in their lives. "I used to be someone," I heard myself saying. Harold and I built a successful business together. We traveled, we had friends, we were active in our community. After he died, it felt like I disappeared too. My children are busy with their own lives, their own families. I understand that, I really do. But this trip was supposed to remind us all why family matters. Frank listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. There was something about his weathered face and patient demeanor that invited confession. Maybe it was his years of solitude in this desert outpost. Or maybe he'd simply learned the value of listening without trying to fix everything. As the second hour stretched on, my phone still showing no signal, I began to face the practical realities of my situation. I had my purse with my wallet, containing about $80 in cash and my credit cards. I had my identification, my medications, and the clothes on my back. Everything else, including my suitcase with a week's worth of clothing, was in Michael's SUV, presumably getting further away with each passing minute. "Is there somewhere I could stay nearby?" I asked Frank, hating how small my voice sounded. Frank's expression grew sympathetic. "Nearest hotel is about 40 miles down the road in Ridgecrest. That's where you folks were headed, I'd guess. There's a motel about 20 miles east, but it's not much to look at. Most travelers don't stay around here unless they have to." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was stranded in the very place I'd most wanted to share with my family, the landscape that held some of my most cherished memories with Harold. But instead of sharing those memories, I was facing the possibility of spending the night alone, in a roadside motel, abandoned by the people I loved most. As if reading my thoughts, Frank said, "Tell you what, there's a lady named Rosa who runs a little bed and breakfast about 15 miles from here. Good woman. Fair prices. I could give her a call, see if she's got room for you tonight. She's helped out other travelers who've found themselves in tight spots." I wanted to refuse, to insist that my family would return at any moment, but the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Even if Michael and the others turned around immediately after discovering my absence, it would take them hours to drive back through the desert. And that was assuming they noticed I was missing anytime soon. "That's very kind of you," I said, my throat tight with emotions I was trying to keep in check. "If you think she wouldn't mind." Frank made the call while I sat in that plastic chair, staring out at the empty highway and trying to make sense of what had happened to my carefully planned family vacation. I could hear him explaining my situation in low, respectful tones, describing me as a nice lady who got separated from her family. Not abandoned, not left behind, separated, as if it were a mutual misunderstanding rather than a devastating betrayal. When he hung up, Frank smiled at me with genuine warmth. "Rosa's got a room for you, and she's coming to pick you up herself. Should be here in about 20 minutes. She says don't worry about payment tonight. You can settle up tomorrow when you're feeling more settled." The kindness of these strangers was overwhelming. Here were people who owed me nothing, who had never seen me before today, and they were extending help without hesitation or judgment. It stood in stark contrast to my family's apparent willingness to drive away without ensuring my safety. As we waited for Rosa, Frank told me about the community of people who lived and worked in this harsh landscape. There weren't many of them, he explained, but they looked out for each other. The desert didn't leave room for pettiness or selfishness. Survival often depended on cooperation and mutual aid. He spoke of tourists who'd broken down and been helped by locals, of travelers who'd returned years later to thank the people who'd assisted them in their time of need. "Desert teaches you what's important," Frank said, reorganizing items on the counter as he talked. "Strip away all the noise and complications, and what's left is pretty basic. Food, water, shelter, and people who'll stand by you when things get tough. Everything else is just decoration." When Rosa arrived, I understood immediately why Frank had spoken of her with such respect. She was a small woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that held both strength and compassion. She wore faded jeans and a cotton shirt that looked like they'd been chosen for comfort, rather than style, but she carried herself with a dignity that was unmistakable. "You must be Janet," she said, approaching me with a warm smile. "I'm Rosa Martinez. Frank told me you've had quite a day." I found myself fighting back tears as I stood to greet her. "I'm so sorry to impose. This isn't how I expected my day to go." Rosa waved away my apologies. "Honey, the desert throws curveballs at all of us. The important thing is how we handle them. Frank says your family got ahead of you somehow?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to explain the full situation without breaking down completely, Rosa seemed to understand without needing details. She thanked Frank for making the call, refused his attempt to pay for my water bottles, and gently guided me toward her truck. As we drove away from the gas station, I looked back to see Frank waving from the doorway. In the space of a few hours, this stranger had shown me more genuine concern and practical help than I'd felt from my own family in recent years. The thought was both comforting and deeply troubling. Rosa's bed and breakfast turned out to be a small adobe house nestled among desert plants and rock formations that looked like natural sculptures. It wasn't fancy, but it had a warmth and authenticity that immediately put me at ease. The rooms were simple but clean, with handmade quilts and local artwork that spoke of pride and attention to detail. "I'll put you in the sunrise room," Rosa said, leading me down a short hallway. "Gets the best light in the morning and the view of the mountains is something special. You hungry?" I was just starting dinner when Frank called. I realized I hadn't eaten since our quick breakfast that morning, but food seemed irrelevant given everything that had happened. Still, Rosa's offer felt like more than politeness. It felt like an invitation to be cared for, something I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. "That's very kind of you, but I don't want to be any trouble." Rosa stopped and turned to face me, her expression gentle but firm. "Janet, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. When someone offers you help, especially when you need it, the kindest thing you can do is accept it gracefully. Refusing help doesn't make you independent. It just makes the other person feel useless." Her words hit me harder than she probably intended. How many times had I refused assistance from neighbors or friends after Harold's death, insisting I could manage on my own? How often had I turned down invitations or opportunities for connection because I didn't want to be a burden? Had my fierce independence actually been a form of selfishness, denying others the chance to show kindness? Dinner was simple but delicious. Grilled chicken with roasted vegetables, and fresh bread that Rosa had made that afternoon. We sat at her kitchen table as the desert sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Rosa didn't push for details about my situation, but she was a natural storyteller herself, sharing tales of the various travelers who'd found their way to her door over the years. "Had a businessman once, fancy suit and everything. Broke down out here in the middle of summer," she said, refilling my water glass. "Thought the world was ending because his phone didn't work and his GPS was useless. Stayed here 3 days waiting for parts for his car. By the time he left, he said it was the first real vacation he'd taken in 20 years. Still sends me Christmas cards." As the evening wore on, I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't expected. Rosa's presence was soothing without being intrusive, and the quiet of the desert night was a sharp contrast to the constant noise and motion of our family road trip. For the first time in days, I wasn't managing schedules or mediating small conflicts or trying to ensure everyone else's comfort. But as bedtime approached, the reality of my situation reasserted itself. Somewhere out there, my family was presumably settling into their hotel in Ridgecrest, perhaps finally realizing that I wasn't with them. Or perhaps not. The thought that they might continue their journey without even noticing my absence was too painful to contemplate for long. Rosa showed me to my room and provided me with toiletries and a nightgown that had belonged to her late sister. "Similar size," she said matter-of-factly. She would have wanted someone to get use out of her. Things. Alone in the sunrise room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, I'd been a woman traveling with her loving family, excited about sharing meaningful experiences with 3 generations of Adam's descendants. Now I was a 73-year-old woman stranded in the desert, dependent on the kindness of strangers, facing the possibility that my own children had deliberately abandoned me. The rational part of my mind still insisted this had to be a misunderstanding. Families didn't just drive away and leave their elderly matriarch at gas stations. There had to be an explanation that would make sense of everything. A phone call, or message that would resolve the confusion and restore the natural order of things. But as I lay in Rosa's comfortable bed, listening to the absolute silence of the desert night, another part of my mind began examining the patterns I'd been ignoring for years. The increasingly short phone calls with my children, the way conversations seemed to end abruptly when I entered rooms during family gatherings. The subtle but persistent feeling that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Had I been so desperate to maintain family connections that I'd failed to notice they were already broken? Had my insistence on this grand road trip been the final straw, the thing that pushed my children from polite tolerance to active avoidance? These questions followed me into an uneasy sleep, where I dreamed of endless highways and empty cars, of voices calling my name from distances I could never cross. I woke several times during the night, briefly disoriented, before remembering where I was and why I was there. When morning came, it brought the spectacular sunrise that had given the room its name. I stood at the window, watching the light transform the desert landscape from gray shadows to gold and red brilliance, and felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the beauty of the scene, or maybe it was the strange peace of being truly alone for the first time in years, but I found myself thinking that perhaps this abandonment, terrible as it was, might also be an opportunity. For the first time since Harold's death, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's happiness or comfort. I wasn't managing schedules or smoothing over family tensions or trying to prove my worth through constant giving. I was simply Janet Adams, 73 years old, standing in a desert sunrise with no obligations except to figure out what came next. Rosa knocked softly on my door as I was getting dressed. "How did you sleep, honey? I've got coffee and breakfast ready when you are." "Thank you," I called back. "I'll be right there." But before I left the room, I took one more look at that sunrise view, trying to memorize every detail. Something told me this moment was important, that whatever came next in my story would somehow trace back to this morning, this room, this realization that being alone didn't necessarily mean being abandoned. Rosa had prepared a full breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, and fruit that somehow tasted better than anything I'd eaten in recent memory. As we ate, she asked gently about my plans for the day. "I suppose I should try to contact my family," I said, though the prospect filled me with dread. "See if I can figure out where they are and how to rejoin them." Rosa nodded thoughtfully. "Frank mentioned your phone wasn't getting signal yesterday. You're welcome to use my landline if you need to make some calls." The offer was generous, but I realized I wasn't sure who to call or what to say. How do you contact family members who may have deliberately left you behind? How do you explain a situation that you don't fully understand yourself? As if sensing my uncertainty, Rosa said, "No pressure, of course. You're welcome to stay another night if you need time to think things through. Sometimes the desert helps people figure out what they really want to do next." Looking back, I think that was the moment I began to understand that this experience might be about more than just being stranded at a gas station. Maybe the desert, as Frank had suggested, was teaching me something important about what really mattered. Maybe being left behind was going to show me who I really was when all the family roles and expectations were stripped away. Maybe Death Valley was about to become my teacher in ways I never could have imagined. The second day in the desert began with a phone call that changed everything. Rosa had given me privacy to use her landline, and after steeling myself with 2 cups of her strong coffee, I dialed Michael's number. My hands trembled as I listened to the ringing, unsure whether I hoped he would answer or not. "Mom?" His voice came through the receiver with what sounded like genuine surprise. "Where are you? We've been looking everywhere." The relief that flooded through me was so intense I had to sit down. They hadn't abandoned me. They were looking for me. This was all a terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved with a simple conversation. "I'm at a bed and breakfast near Death Valley," I said, my voice catching. "You all left without me at the gas station yesterday. I've been so worried." There was a pause that lasted too long. In that silence, I could hear muffled voices in the background, urgent whispered conversations that I couldn't quite make out. When Michael spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly. "Mom, we thought you were in Lisa's car. She thought you were with us." By the time we realized the mix-up, we were already in Ridgecrest. "We drove back to look for you, but the gas station was closed and there was no sign of you anywhere." Something about his explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it. But I pushed that thought away. I was being paranoid, letting my insecurities cloud my judgment. Of course they'd been looking for me. Of course this was all a misunderstanding. "The gas station owner helped me find a place to stay," I explained. "I'm safe, just worried sick about all of you." "We're so sorry, Mom. We've been calling hotels and asking at gas stations." Sarah's been beside herself with guilt. His voice carried just the right note of concern, the kind of tone he'd used as a child when explaining why he'd come home past curfew. We arranged to meet at the same gas station where everything had gone wrong. Michael said they'd drive back that afternoon to collect me, and we could continue our trip as planned. I thanked Rosa profusely for her kindness and prepared to rejoin my family, feeling foolish for the dark thoughts that had plagued me through the night. But as I waited at Frank's gas station for the second time in 2 days, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Frank kept glancing at me with concern, or maybe it was the memory of how peaceful I'd felt watching the sunrise alone in Rosa's guest room. For the first time in years, I'd spent 24 hours without worrying about anyone else's needs or feelings, and the experience had been revelatory. When the familiar blue SUV pulled into the gas station lot, followed by Lisa's sedan, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also something that might have been disappointment. My brief taste of independence was about to end, and I'd be back to my familiar role as the family matriarch who tried too hard and expected too little in return. Sarah was the first one out of the car, rushing toward me with tears in her eyes and arms outstretched. "Janet, thank God you're..." Okay, we were so scared. Her embrace felt genuine, and I allowed myself to be enveloped by her concern. Maybe I really had been overthinking everything. Maybe families were just complicated, and love didn't always express itself in the ways we expected. Michael hugged me next, followed by Lisa and Greg and even teenage Brandon, who actually looked up from his phone long enough to mumble an apology for the confusion. The twins chattered excitedly about their adventure driving through the desert, looking for Grandma, turning my abandonment into a story about their own heroic search efforts. "We checked every hotel in Ridgecrest," Lisa said, her voice tight with what seemed like genuine distress. "The front desk clerks all knew about a missing elderly woman, but no one had seen you." "I wasn't in Ridgecrest," I said, gesturing toward Frank, who was watching our reunion from behind the counter. This kind man helped me find a wonderful woman who runs a bed and breakfast. I was perfectly safe. I wanted to tell them about Rosa's kindness, about the sunset dinner and the sunrise view, about the unexpected peace I'd found in solitude. But as I looked at their faces, all focused on getting back on the road and returning to our planned itinerary, I realized they weren't really interested in my experience. They were relieved I was safe, yes, but they were more concerned with moving past this inconvenient interruption to their vacation. "Well, the important thing is we found you," Michael said, already moving toward the car. "We should probably get going if we want to reach LA on schedule." I thanked Frank for his help, pressing a $20 bill into his hand despite his protests. As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, he caught my arm gently. "You take care, Mrs. Adams," he said quietly. "And remember what I told you about the desert teaching us what's important." His words stayed with me as I settled into the familiar passenger seat of Michael's SUV. Everyone seemed determined to treat yesterday's events as nothing more than an unfortunate miscommunication. But Frank's reminder about desert lessons made Me wonder if there was more to learn from this experience. The drive toward Los Angeles should have been a return to normalcy, but instead, it felt like stepping back into a role that no longer fit quite right. Sarah resumed her efforts to manage the twins' entertainment. Michael focused on navigation and traffic, and I found myself relegated to the position of passenger in my own vacation once again. But something had shifted in my perspective during those 24 hours of solitude. I noticed things I'd missed before, the way conversations stopped when I offered opinions about restaurants or routes, the subtle eye rolls when I shared memories or observations, the sense that my presence was being tolerated rather than welcomed. During a lunch stop in Barstow, I excused myself to use the restroom and overheard Sarah talking to Lisa at a nearby table. "Thank God we found her," Sarah was saying. "Can you imagine if something had actually happened? Michael would never forgive himself." "At least she was safe," Lisa replied. Though honestly, I was starting to think this might be a blessing in disguise. She's been so intense about this whole trip, planning every detail, wanting us to be grateful for every scenic overlook and family bonding moment. I know what you mean. She means well, but sometimes it feels like she's trying to buy our affection with these grand gestures, like she thinks if she spends enough money and plans enough activities, we'll all magically become the close-knit family she wants us to be. Sarah's laugh was not unkind, but it cut through me like a blade. The twins have been complaining about all the forced family time. They just want to swim in hotel pools and play their games, not listen to lectures about geological formations. And Brandon's been asking when we can just go home. He misses his friends and his regular routine. This whole thing has been more stressful than relaxing. I stood frozen in the hallway outside the restroom, feeling like I was eavesdropping on my own life. Was this how my family really saw me? As a needy old woman trying to purchase love through expensive vacations and forced togetherness? When I returned to the table, everyone smiled and made space for me, resuming conversations about our afternoon plans with apparent enthusiasm. But now I could see the performance in their politeness, the effort it took to maintain the facade of family harmony. The remainder of the drive to Los Angeles passed in a strange haze. I participated in conversations and responded to questions, but part of me remained detached, observing the dynamics I'd been blind to for so long. I began to understand that my family's love for me was real, but it was also complicated by obligation, guilt, and a desire to keep me happy without having to engage too deeply with my actual needs or feelings. Our hotel in Los Angeles was beautiful, exactly the kind of luxury accommodation I'd booked to make this trip special. I'd reserved a suite for Michael's family and connecting rooms for Lisa's family and myself, imagining cozy evenings spent sharing stories and planning the next day's adventures. Instead, everyone seemed eager to retreat to their separate spaces. The twins wanted to watch movies on the room's large television. Brandon disappeared into his phone, and the adults made polite excuses about needing to rest after the long drive. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting alone in my elegant hotel room, looking out at the glittering lights of the city and feeling more isolated than I had during my night in the desert. I found myself thinking about Rosa's small adobe house and her simple but heartfelt hospitality. She'd asked nothing of me except that I accept her kindness gracefully. There had been no hidden agendas or complex family dynamics to navigate, just human decency offered freely to a stranger in need. The next morning brought a carefully orchestrated family breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Everyone was present and accounted for, making appropriate conversation about our plans for the day. We were scheduled to visit Disneyland, something I'd arranged because I thought the grandchildren would enjoy it, and because it seemed like the kind of memory-making experience that would bring us closer together. But as we made our way through the crowded theme park, I began to see our family dynamics with painful clarity. The twins were indeed having fun, but they were more interested in the rides and attractions than in sharing the experience with their grandmother. Brandon participated grudgingly, clearly viewing the entire outing as something to endure rather than enjoy. The adults took turns managing logistics and mediating minor conflicts, but there was an underlying tension that suggested everyone was working hard to maintain appearances. I found myself wondering what would happen if I simply stopped trying so hard. What if I quit planning activities and making suggestions and paying for elaborate experiences? Would my family miss my efforts, or would they be relieved to be free of the obligations my generosity created? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. If I wasn't the grandmother who planned special trips and bought thoughtful gifts and remembered every birthday and anniversary, who would I be to these people? What role would I have in their lives if I wasn't constantly proving my worth through acts of service and financial support? That evening, as we gathered for dinner at an expensive restaurant I'd chosen and was paying for, I decided to conduct a small experiment. Instead of directing the conversation or sharing stories or making suggestions about our final day's activities, I simply listened. I responded when spoken to directly, but I didn't initiate topics or try to fill awkward silences. The result was illuminating. Conversations flowed more naturally without my attempts to guide them. Michael and Greg talked about work and sports, Sarah and Lisa discussed their children's schools and activities, and even the teenagers seemed more relaxed without my efforts to include them in adult discussions. But I also noticed that no one asked about my interests or experiences. No one inquired about my life back home or my feelings about Harold's death or my hopes for the future. The conversations that flowed so naturally without my interference also flowed around me, as if I were a benevolent presence whose main function was to nod appreciatively and pick up the check. Back in my hotel room that night, I called Rosa's bed and breakfast. I told myself I just wanted to thank her again for her kindness, but as we talked, I found myself sharing my observations about family dynamics and the loneliness that could exist even in the midst of people who loved you. "Honey," Rosa said in her gentle but direct way, "sounds to me like you've been working so hard to be the kind of grandmother you think they want, that you've forgotten to be the kind of person you actually are." Her words hit me with the force of revelation. When had I stopped being Janet and started being just grandma, mother, the family benefactor whose identity was entirely defined by my relationships to other people? "I don't even know who I am anymore without those roles," I admitted. "Since Harold died, I've felt like I'm disappearing a little more each day. This trip was supposed to remind everyone that I matter, that I'm still here and still part of the family. But sweetie, you can't make people appreciate you by trying harder. Real appreciation comes when people see your authentic self and choose to value it. If you're always performing the role of the perfect grandmother, they never get the chance to know the real Janet." Rosa's wisdom stayed with me through our final day in Los Angeles. We visited the Hollywood Walk of Fame and took pictures in front of the famous sign, checking items off the tourist itinerary I'd carefully planned. But I found myself paying more attention to the subtle dynamics playing out within our group than to the attractions we were seeing. I noticed how naturally Lisa and Sarah collaborated when one of the children needed attention, how Michael and Greg fell into easy conversation about shared interests, how even the teenagers found common ground in their mutual eye-rolling at adult enthusiasms. They were a family, but they were a family that had learned to function around my presence rather than with it. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it felt strangely freeing. If my family could navigate their relationships without my constant management and financial support, then maybe I could stop carrying the burden of being responsible for everyone's happiness. Maybe I could start figuring out what Janet Adams wanted from life, instead of what everyone else needed from her. Our flight back to Ohio was scheduled for the following morning, but as I lay in my hotel bed that final night, I found myself thinking about the sunrise view from Rosa's guest room and Frank's words about the desert teaching us what's important. I thought about the peace I'd felt during those 24 hours when I'd been responsible only for myself, when I'd been cared for by strangers who asked nothing in return except that I accept their kindness. What if I didn't get on that plane tomorrow? What if instead of returning to my empty house in Ohio and my routine of weekly phone calls and carefully planned visits, I chose something different? What if I used this unexpected lesson in independence to actually become independent? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. At 73, was it too late to start over? Could I build a life based on what I wanted rather than what others expected of me? And if I did, would my family even notice? Or would they simply be relieved to be free of the obligations my presence created? I spent most of that night staring at the ceiling, weighing possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I was going to find out who Janet Adams really was when she wasn't trying to be everything to everyone else. The conversation with my family at breakfast was more difficult than I'd anticipated. When I announced that I wouldn't be flying back to Ohio with them, that I planned to return to Death Valley and spend some time figuring out my next steps, the reactions ranged from confusion to concern to barely concealed relief. "Mom, you can't be serious," Michael said, his voice carrying the tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "You can't just stay in the desert by yourself. What if something happens? What if you get sick or hurt?" "I'm 73. "Not 93, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'm capable of taking care of myself, and I'll be staying with people who've already shown me more genuine kindness than I've experienced in years." Sarah looked genuinely distressed. "Janet, if this is about the gas station thing, we really are sorry. It was an honest mistake, and we were terrified when we couldn't find you." "This isn't about blame or punishment," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "This is about me finally admitting that I've been trying so hard to hold our family together that I've forgotten to hold myself together. I need some time to remember who I am when I'm not managing everyone else's needs." Lisa's response was perhaps the most honest. "Mom, we love you, but maybe some space would be good for all of us. This trip has been intense. Maybe we've all been trying too hard to force something that needs to develop more naturally." Her words stung, but they also validated what I'd been sensing throughout our journey. We all needed permission to step back from the artificial closeness I'd been trying to create and figure out how to love each other without the burden of constant performance. The goodbyes at the airport were emotional but not devastating. Everyone hugged me and made me promise to stay in touch, to let them know if I needed anything, to not hesitate to call if I changed my mind about coming home. But underneath the expressions of concern, I could sense a collective exhale, a relief that the pressure to maintain perfect family harmony could finally be relaxed. As I watched their plane taxi away from the gate, I felt a mix of sadness and anticipation. I was saying goodbye to more than just my family. I was saying goodbye to the version of myself that had defined her worth through their approval and needed their constant presence to feel valuable. The drive back to Death Valley felt like a journey into unknown territory, even though I was retracing a route I'd traveled just days before. But this time, I was traveling alone, by choice, toward people who had already accepted me without expecting me to be anything other than who I was. Rosa's face when she opened her door to find me standing there with my suitcase was a mixture of surprise and understanding. "Well, hello again, Janet. I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." "I hope you don't mind," I said, suddenly uncertain about the impulsiveness of my decision. I know I should have called first, but I found myself needing to come back here. I'm not sure I can explain why. Rosa's smile was warm and knowing. "Honey, the desert calls people back when they're ready to hear what it's trying to teach them. You don't need to explain anything to me. The sunrise room is empty and supper's in an hour. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." As I settled back into the room that had briefly been my refuge, I realized that for the first time in 5 years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I chose to do, without considering anyone else's needs or expectations. It was a strange and wonderful feeling. That night, as Rosa and I shared another simple meal at her kitchen table, I found myself talking about Harold in ways I hadn't been able to with my own family. I told her about our dreams of traveling together in retirement, about the business we'd built from nothing, about the partnership we'd shared that had been based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. "Sounds like you two had something special," Rosa said, refilling my wine glass with the bottle I'd contributed to our meal. "No wonder his loss hit you so hard." "I think I've been trying to recreate that sense of partnership with my children," I admitted. "But they don't need a partner, they need a mother, and I don't need to be needed in the same way I was needed when they were young." Rosa nodded thoughtfully. "It's hard when the roles that defined us for so long stop fitting, but maybe that's not a loss. Maybe it's an opportunity to discover what else we can be." As the desert night settled around us, filled with the kind of silence that existed nowhere else in my experience, I began to understand that my abandonment at the gas station had been a gift rather than a betrayal. It had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding and had introduced me to people who saw value in me beyond my usefulness to others. I was beginning to learn what Frank had meant about the desert teaching you what's important. Stripped of the familiar roles and relationships that had defined me, I was starting to discover that Janet Adams was more than just a mother, grandmother, and widow. She was a woman with her own interests, opinions, and capacity for growth, even at 73. The realization was both humbling and exhilarating. I had work to do, lessons to learn, and a life to rebuild. But for the first time since Harold's death, I felt excited about the possibilities ahead, rather than trapped by the limitations of the past. The third week in the desert brought an unexpected visitor. I was helping Rosa tend her small vegetable garden when we heard the sound of a car pulling into the gravel driveway. Living in such an isolated area, Rosa didn't get many unexpected guests, so we both looked up with curiosity as a rental car came to a stop near the house. My heart jumped when I recognized the figure stepping out of the driver's seat. It was my daughter Lisa, looking decidedly out of place in her business attire and city shoes as she navigated the desert terrain. She spotted me among the tomato plants and waved tentatively, her expression uncertain. "Mom? I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." I wiped the dirt from my hands on the old apron Rosa had lent me, feeling strangely self-conscious about being caught in such a domestic, earthy activity. For the past few weeks, I'd been living a life completely divorced from the refined suburban existence my children associated with me. I wore comfortable clothes, got my hands dirty, and spent my days in simple, meaningful tasks rather than elaborate social obligations. "Lisa, what a surprise! What brings you all the way out here?" She glanced around at the adobe house, the desert landscape, and Rosa, who was tactfully gathering her gardening tools to give us privacy. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you're really okay. We've all been worried." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't just a casual check-in. Lisa had always been the more direct of my two children, less inclined than Michael to soften difficult conversations with pleasantries. If she'd driven all the way from Los Angeles, where she'd extended her business trip to make this detour, there was something specific on her mind. Rosa invited Lisa inside for some iced tea, and soon we were sitting in the comfortable living room where I'd spent so many peaceful evenings over the past weeks. Lisa looked around at the simple furnishings, the local artwork, and the books, scattered on side tables, clearly trying to understand what had drawn me to this place. "It's very peaceful here," she said diplomatically, accepting a glass of Rosa's homemade mint tea. "I can see why you'd want to rest and recover after our, challenging trip." "Is that what you think I'm doing? Resting and recovering?" Lisa set down her glass and looked at me directly. "Mom, I need to be honest with you about something. We're all concerned that you're having some kind of breakdown. This whole thing, staying in the desert, refusing to come home, it's not like you." Her words hit me with a mixture of hurt and understanding. Of course, my sudden change in behavior would seem alarming to children who'd known me only in my carefully constructed role as the devoted family matriarch. They had no context for understanding that I might be growing rather than breaking down. What would be like me, Lisa? Planning elaborate vacations that stress everyone out? Trying to buy family closeness with expensive gifts and activities? Calling every week to check on everyone whether they want to hear from me or not? Lisa flinched slightly at my directness. That's not fair, Mom. You know we appreciate everything you do for us. Do you? Or do you tolerate it because you feel obligated? I kept my voice gentle, but I was determined to have the honest conversation we'd been avoiding for years. When was the last time you called me just because you wanted to talk, not because you felt guilty for not calling? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Lisa struggling with how to respond. She was a successful attorney, skilled at navigating difficult conversations with clients and colleagues, but this personal territory was more challenging than any courtroom argument. Mom, I know we haven't been as close as we used to be. Everyone gets busy with their own lives, their own families. That's normal. It is normal, I agreed. But what's not normal is the way I've been desperately trying to prevent that natural evolution. I've been clinging so tightly to outdated roles that I've forgotten to develop new ones. Rosa had quietly excused herself to run errands in town, leaving Lisa and me alone to navigate this conversation. I could see my daughter's discomfort, but I also sensed her genuine concern beneath the awkwardness. Lisa, can I ask you something, and will you give me an honest answer? She nodded, though her expression suggested she was bracing herself. If I never planned another family vacation, never sent another care package, never called to check in unless you contacted me first, would you miss me? Not the things I do for you, but me? The question clearly caught her off guard. She started to give what I suspected would be an automatic reassurance, then stopped herself. For several long moments, she stared out the window at the desert, landscape, and I could almost see her wrestling with her own honesty. I don't know, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's a terrible thing to admit, but I honestly don't know. You've been the person who holds everything together for so long that I'm not sure any of us know who you are when you're not doing that job. Her honesty was painful, but also liberating. At least now we were dealing with truth instead of polite pretense. That's exactly why I needed to come here, I said. I needed to find out who I am when I'm not performing that role. And you know what I've discovered? I like myself better when I'm not constantly trying to prove my worth to people who love me out of obligation. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. Mom, we don't love you out of obligation. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you enjoyed spending time with me without feeling like you had to manage my expectations or humor my attempts at family bonding? She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of recognition, of finally acknowledging truths that had been hiding in plain sight. I hate that you're right, Lisa said eventually. I hate that somewhere along the way, your love started feeling like pressure instead of comfort, but I don't know how that happened or how to fix it. Maybe it doesn't need to be fixed, I suggested. Maybe it just needs to be acknowledged so we can start fresh. Maybe we need to get to know each other as adults instead of as mother and daughter trapped in patterns we established 30 years ago. Rosa returned as the afternoon was waning, tactfully busying herself in the kitchen while Lisa and I continued our conversation on the front porch. The desert sunset was beginning its spectacular display, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never failed to take my breath away. It's beautiful here, Lisa admitted, watching the light transform the landscape. I can understand why you'd want to stay for a while. It's not just the beauty, I said. It's the simplicity. Rosa treats me like a person, not like a role. She appreciates my help with small tasks without making me feel like I'm intruding. She listens to my stories without that polite, patient expression I've gotten used to seeing on family faces. Lisa winced. Do we really do that? You do. You all do. And I understand why. I've been telling the same stories and making the same observations for years, trying to create connection through repetition instead of genuine interaction. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors deepen across the sky. Finally, Lisa asked the question I'd been expecting. So what happens now? Are you planning to stay here permanently? What about your house, your life back home? I don't know yet, I admitted. That's part of what I'm trying to figure out. But I do know that I'm not ready to go back to being the person I was before. She wasn't very happy, and she wasn't making anyone else happy either. Lisa reached over and took my hand. Something she hadn't done spontaneously in years. I want you to be happy, Mom. He was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him choosing his words carefully. Honestly? No. I love you, Mom, but that version of you felt exhausting sometimes. This version seems more relaxed, more like yourself. His honesty was a gift, confirmation that the changes I was making were benefiting everyone, not just me. I was learning to love my family without needing to control them, to maintain connection without sacrificing my own identity. The desert autumn brought cooler temperatures and a different quality of light that made the landscape even more beautiful. I'd been in Death Valley for nearly 2 months, and what had started as an indefinite escape was beginning to feel like a permanent choice. Rosa and I had developed an easy partnership in running the bed and breakfast. I handled much of the guest interaction and booking management, while she focused on the hospitality and maintenance aspects. We were talking about making the arrangement official, about me becoming a business partner rather than just an extended guest. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. At 73, was I really prepared to start over completely? Could I build a new life in this harsh, beautiful place, surrounded by people who'd known me only as the person I was becoming rather than the person I'd always been? One evening, as I sat in the sunrise room that had become my sanctuary, I called my children to share my thoughts about staying permanently. The conversations were easier than I'd expected, partly because I was proposing a choice rather than seeking permission or approval. "Are you sure, Mom?" Lisa asked. "It's such a big change, so far from everything familiar." "That's exactly why it feels right," I told her. "I need distance from the familiar patterns. I need space to discover who Janet Adams can be when she's not trying to be everything to everyone else." Michael's response was perhaps the most telling. "If this is what makes you happy, then I support it completely. We can visit, and you can come see us when you want to, not because you feel obligated." The absence of guilt or manipulation in our conversation felt revolutionary. We were talking as adults making individual choices rather than family members, bound by obligation and expectation. Sarah's reaction when Michael passed along the news was surprisingly positive. "Tell her we think it's brave," she said during a conference call that included all of them. The kids have been asking about Grandma's desert adventure. They think it's cool that she's starting over somewhere new. Even the grandchildren seemed to understand the situation better than I'd expected. Brandon, the teenager who'd been so reluctant to engage during our family trip, actually asked thoughtful questions about what it was like to live in such an isolated place. The twins wanted to know if there were any animals in the desert, and whether I was learning to be a cowboy. Their easy acceptance of my choice reinforced my growing understanding that children are often more adaptable than the adults who worry about protecting them from change. They could love their grandmother whether she lived in Ohio or Death Valley, whether she was the family organizer or the desert entrepreneur. As autumn deepened into winter, I found myself settling into rhythms I'd never experienced before. I woke with the sun, spent my mornings in Rose's garden or helping with guest services, dedicated my afternoons to the support group and community projects, and spent my evenings reading or talking with new friends or simply sitting in the vast silence of the desert night. It was a simple life, but it was rich in ways my previous existence had never been. Every day brought small satisfactions, connections with people who chose to be in my life rather than being obligated to tolerate me. Tasks that felt meaningful rather than performed. The old Janet would have been planning elaborate Christmas celebrations by now, coordinating schedules and buying expensive gifts and trying to create perfect holiday memories. The new Janet was content to help Rosa prepare the bed and breakfast for winter guests and to organize a simple holiday gathering for the women in our support group. The difference felt like the difference between performing life and actually living it. I was finally learning what Frank had meant about the desert, teaching you what's important. When everything unnecessary is stripped away, what remains is surprisingly sufficient. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early December, just as I was helping Rosa prepare breakfast for a couple of hikers who'd stayed the night. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the early hour and the persistent ringing made me answer despite my usual policy of letting Rosa handle business calls. "Is this Janet Adams?" The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "Yes, this is Janet. May I ask who's calling?" "My name is Detective Maria Santos with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling regarding some suspicious financial activity that may involve members of your family." The words hit me like cold water. I set down the coffee pot I'd been holding and moved away from the kitchen where Rosa was cooking, seeking privacy, for what I sensed would be a difficult conversation. "I'm sorry, Detective, but I'm not sure I understand. What kind of financial activity?" "Mrs. Adams, I need to ask you some questions about your recent travel arrangements and your current living situation. According to our investigation, there have been some irregularities involving your bank accounts and credit cards during the past few months." My mouth went dry. "What kind of irregularities?" "Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers, and credit card charges that don't match your known location or spending patterns. We've been tracking these transactions as part of a broader investigation into financial fraud targeting elderly individuals." I sank into Rosa's reading chair, my mind reeling. "Detective, I haven't made any large withdrawals or wire transfers. I've been living very simply here in Death Valley for the past few months." "That's what we suspected, Mrs. Adams, which is why we need to talk. Can you tell me who has access to your financial accounts? Who knows your personal information, social security number, banking details?" The implication of her questions was slowly becoming clear, and I felt a sick understanding beginning to form in my stomach. "My children have some access to my accounts. I set up emergency authorizations years ago in case something happened to me." "I see. And where are your children currently residing?" "Ohio. Well, my son Michael lives in Ohio. My daughter Lisa travels frequently for business, but her home base is also Ohio." There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Mrs. Adams, we have records of significant financial activity originating from California, specifically from the Los Angeles area, beginning approximately 3 days after your reported disappearance from a Death Valley gas station." The words "reported disappearance" rang in my ears. "I wasn't missing, Detective. I chose to stay here. Who reported me as missing?" "According to our records, your son Michael Adams filed a missing person report with the Los Angeles Police Department, claiming that you had disappeared during a family vacation and that there were concerns about your mental capacity and vulnerability to exploitation." I felt the ground shifting beneath me. "I want us all to be happy. If that means making some changes in how we relate to each other, then maybe that's what we need to do." Her willingness to consider change gave me hope that our relationship might evolve into something more authentic and sustainable. We spent the evening talking more honestly than we had in years, sharing observations about family dynamics and individual needs that we'd never been brave enough to voice before. Lisa stayed overnight in Rosa's second guest room, and the three of us shared breakfast the next morning like old friends. I watched my daughter interact with Rosa, saw her relax in ways that reminded me of the girl she'd been before life got complicated by career pressures and parenting responsibilities. "Your mother's been a blessing to have around," Rosa told Lisa as we cleared the breakfast dishes. "She's got a natural way with the garden, and she's been helping me organize some community projects. We've been talking about maybe starting a support group for women who are navigating life transitions." Lisa looked surprised. "Really? That sounds interesting." It was the first time I'd mentioned the idea out loud, though Rosa and I had been discussing it for several days. There were other women in the scattered desert community who were dealing with various kinds of upheaval: divorce, widowhood, empty nest syndrome, retirement adjustments. Rosa had suggested that my experience with family dynamics and my natural organizing abilities could be valuable in creating a space for mutual support. "There's a real need for it out here," I explained to Lisa. "People are isolated, and traditional support systems aren't always available. Sometimes just having a place to talk honestly about life changes can make all the difference." Lisa studied my face with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Mom, you sound different, more confident, more purposeful. It's like you found something you didn't even know you were looking for." Her observation was accurate. The past few weeks had shown me that I had skills and interests beyond family management. I enjoyed the practical work of helping Rosa with her bed and breakfast. I found satisfaction in the simple tasks of gardening and cooking and maintaining a household without the pressure of entertaining guests or managing complex schedules. More importantly, I'd discovered that I could form new relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The handful of neighbors I'd met through Rosa valued my contributions without expecting me to be anything other than myself. There was no history of disappointed expectations or entrenched patterns to navigate. When Lisa prepared to leave that afternoon, our goodbye felt different from any we'd shared in recent years. Instead of the usual mixture of guilt and relief that characterized our visits, there was genuine affection and a sense of possibility. "Will you call me?" she asked as she loaded her suitcase into the rental car. "Not because you feel like you should, but because you want to share what you're doing out here." "I will," I promised. "And will you call me when you have something you actually want to talk about, not just to check a daughter duty off your list?" She laughed, but it was a real laugh, not the polite kind. "Deal. And Mom, I'm proud of you for doing this. It takes courage to change your life at any age, but especially at 73. After Lisa left, Rosa and I sat on the porch in the gathering dusk, sharing a bottle of wine and reflecting on the visit. "That went well," Rosa observed. "Your daughter seems like a good person who's been struggling with some difficult feelings." "We all have been," I admitted. "I think I've been so afraid of losing my children's love that I never gave them the chance to choose to love me freely. I was always working so hard to earn something they might have given naturally if I'd just trusted them." "Fear makes us do strange things sometimes," Rosa said gently. "But it sounds like you're both ready to try a different approach." Over the following days, I found myself thinking more seriously about Rosa's suggestion regarding the support group. I'd always been good at organizing events and bringing people together, skills I'd developed through years of family management and community volunteering. But this would be different from planning charity luncheons or coordinating holiday gatherings. This would be about creating genuine connection and mutual support. I started reaching out to women Rosa knew, having informal conversations about their experiences and needs. There was Margaret, a recent divorcee in her 60s who was struggling to rebuild her life after 35 years of marriage. There was Carmen, whose adult children had moved away for work, leaving her feeling purposeless in the small desert town where she'd raised them. There was Beth, a retired teacher who was battling depression and isolation after losing her sense of professional identity. Each conversation revealed common themes: loneliness, uncertainty about the future, a sense that the roles that had defined them were no longer adequate. These women were dealing with many of the same issues I'd been facing. The challenge of reinventing yourself when the life you'd built no longer fit your reality. The first official meeting of what we decided to call the Desert Transitions Group took place in Rosa's living room on a Thursday evening. 6 women showed up, ranging in age from 54 to 78, each bringing their own stories of change and challenge. What surprised me was how naturally I fell into the role of facilitator. Without the pressure of family expectations or the need to prove my worth, I found I could listen without trying to fix, ask questions without judging, and share my own experiences without performing the role of wise matriarch. The thing that's hardest for me, Margaret shared during that first meeting, is figuring out who I am when I'm not somebody's wife or somebody's mother. Those identities shaped everything I did for so long that I don't know what I want or need when it's just me. Her words resonated with every woman in the room. We'd all spent decades defining ourselves in relation to others, and the prospect of independent identity felt both thrilling and terrifying. I think that's exactly what we're here to explore, I found myself saying. Not to find quick answers, but to sit with the questions and support each other through the uncertainty. As the weeks passed and our group continued to meet, I noticed changes not just in the other women but in myself. I was developing new friendships based on shared experiences rather than family obligation. I was using skills I'd forgotten I possessed, creating structure and support without the exhausting pressure of managing everyone's happiness. Most surprisingly, I was sleeping better than I had in years. The anxiety that had plagued me since Harold's death, the constant worry about whether I was doing enough for my family, had largely disappeared. I still missed my children and grandchildren, but the desperate neediness was gone. Michael called one evening while I was preparing dinner with Rosa. We'd established a pattern of weekly conversations that felt natural rather than forced, brief check-ins that allowed us to stay connected without the weight of unfulfilled expectations. "Mom, Lisa told me about your support group. It sounds like you're really building something meaningful out there." "I am," I said, surprised by how easily the words came. "I'm discovering that I have things to offer beyond family caretaking. It's been refreshing to use my skills in new ways." "I'm glad," he said, and I could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. "You sound happier than you have in a long time. Less worried, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For the first time since Harold's death, I wasn't consumed with anxiety about my family's well-being or my own relevance in their lives. I was building a life based on choice rather than obligation, connection rather than control. "Michael, can I ask you something? Do you miss the old version of me, the one who called constantly and planned elaborate events and tried to orchestrate family closeness?" He filed a missing person report, but he knew where I was. "We've been talking regularly. He came to collect me from the gas station, and I chose to return here afterward. Mrs. Adams, I think we need to have a longer conversation. Would it be possible for me to meet with you in person? There are some documents I'd like you to review, and some questions about the timeline of events that I need to clarify." Detective Santos arrived at Rosa's bed and breakfast 3 hours later, driving an unmarked sedan and carrying a briefcase full of documents that would shatter everything I thought I understood about my family's concern for my welfare. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind but serious eyes, the kind of person who'd clearly seen enough human deception to be skeptical of almost everything. Rosa offered her coffee and then tactfully withdrew to give us privacy. Detective Santos spread papers across the kitchen table, bank statements and transaction records that painted a picture I could barely comprehend. "Mrs. Adams, let me walk you through what we've discovered. On August 15th, 3 days after, the missing person report was filed. There was a wire transfer of $50,000 from your savings account to an account in your son's name. The authorization used your electronic signature and personal identification numbers. She showed me a copy of the transfer document, and there was indeed what appeared to be my signature, though I had no memory of authorizing any such transaction. On August 18th, there was another transfer, this time for $35,000, to an account belonging to your daughter Lisa Adams Brennan. Again, using your electronic authorization codes. The numbers were staggering. I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Detective, I never authorized these transfers. I would never move that kind of money without careful consideration. We believe you, Mrs. Adams. What we think happened is that your family used the missing person report and your supposed vulnerable state to gain emergency access to your accounts. Financial institutions will sometimes expedite access requests when there's a documented emergency and family members can provide the necessary identification numbers. She continued laying out the evidence. Credit card charges at expensive hotels and restaurants, none of which I had made. Cash advances totaling thousands of dollars. Investment account liquidations that I'd known nothing about. The total amount involved is approximately $130,000 over a period of 6 weeks, Detective Santos said quietly, all accessed using your personal information and justified by the claim that you were missing and potentially incapacitated. I felt physically sick. But they knew I wasn't missing. We spoke regularly. They even visited me here. Which is what makes this particularly troubling. It appears that the missing person report was filed not out of genuine concern, but as a way to access your finances while you were out of contact with your normal banking routines. The detective explained that my case had come to their attention as part of a broader investigation into elder financial abuse. A bank employee had flagged the unusual activity, particularly the large transfers so soon after a missing person report was filed. Mrs. Adams, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your relationship with your children. Had there been any discussions about money, inheritance, or financial planning prior to your trip? I thought back to the months before our vacation, trying to remember conversations that might have seemed innocent at the time but could have had hidden significance. There had been discussions about estate planning, casual questions about my financial security, suggestions that I might want to simplify my banking arrangements. My daughter-in-law Sarah mentioned that it would be easier for everyone if I consolidated my accounts, I remembered slowly. She said it would make it simpler for them to help me if I ever needed assistance. I thought she was just being thoughtful. And did you provide them with account numbers, passwords, or other financial information? Some of it, yes. They said it was for emergency purposes only, in case something happened to me while we were traveling. The words tasted bitter as I spoke them. I trusted them completely. Detective Santos nodded sympathetically. Financial abuse by family members is more common than most people realize, particularly targeting older adults. The victims often don't report it because they don't want to believe their own children would steal from them. As she continued to explain the scope of what had happened, I found myself remembering details from our trip that suddenly took on new significance. The way Michael and Sarah had exchanged glances when I mentioned my financial security. Lisa's questions about my investment portfolio. The subtle conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. What happens now? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the betrayal. That depends partly on what you want to do, Mrs. Adams. We can pursue criminal charges, which would likely result in prosecution for theft and fraud. Or we can help you pursue civil remedies to recover the stolen funds. Both processes can be lengthy and emotionally difficult. The thought of my own children facing criminal charges was almost unbearable, but the alternative was accepting that they had stolen more than $100,000 from me while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. I need time to think about this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course. But Mrs. Adams, there's something else you should know. We believe this wasn't an opportunistic crime. The coordination required, the timing of the missing person report, the systematic way your accounts were accessed, this appears to have been planned well in advance. Her words hit me like a physical blow. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate response to financial pressure. My children had planned to rob me before we ever left Ohio. After Detective Santos left, I sat alone in Rosa's kitchen, staring at copies of the documents she'd left for my review. The evidence was undeniable, but my heart was struggling to accept what my mind could clearly see. Rosa found me there an hour later, still sitting at the table with the papers spread before me like accusations. "Oh, honey," she said, taking one look at my face and immediately understanding that something terrible had happened. "What did that detective tell you?" I explained everything, watching Rosa's expression shift from confusion to anger to deep sadness. She listened without interruption, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. "Those children of yours," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "How could they do such a thing? And to their own mother?" "I keep asking myself if I somehow deserved this," I admitted. "If I was so controlling, so demanding, that they felt justified in taking what they saw as their inheritance early." Rosa's response was swift and firm. "Janet Adams, don't you dare blame yourself for their choices. There is no justification for stealing from your own mother, regardless of any family dynamics. What they did was criminal, and it was wrong." But even as she spoke, I found myself remembering conversations from our trip, moments when I'd sensed undercurrents I couldn't quite identify. Had there been signs I'd missed? Clues that my children were planning something beyond a simple family vacation? The phone rang as we sat there, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Rosa answered, speaking in low tones before hanging up and turning back to me with a grim expression. "That was Frank from the gas station. He says there's been someone asking questions about you, showing pictures and claiming to be from a private investigation firm hired by your family." The pieces were beginning to fall into place in a way that made me feel nauseated. "They're trying to build a case that I'm mentally incompetent, aren't they? That I'm unable to manage my own affairs?" Rosa nodded slowly. "It sounds like they're covering their bases, creating documentation that would support their claim that they had to take emergency action to protect your finances." I spent the rest of the day trying to process the magnitude of what my children had done. This wasn't just theft, it was a comprehensive assault on my autonomy and dignity. They had reported me missing when they knew exactly where I was. They had suggested I was mentally vulnerable when I was making the clearest decisions I'd made in years. They had stolen my money while expressing concern for my welfare. That evening, as Rosa and I prepared dinner together, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What are you going to do about this, Janet? Are you going to press charges?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "The thought of sending my own children to prison is almost unbearable. But the thought of letting them get away with this feels wrong, too." "What does your gut tell you?" I considered her question seriously. What did my gut tell me? It told me that my children had crossed a line from which there might be no return. It told me that their actions revealed a fundamental lack of respect for me as a person. It told me that they had planned this deception carefully and deliberately, which meant they were capable of planning other deceptions in the future. My gut tells me that if I don't hold them accountable, they'll see this as permission to continue taking advantage of me, I said slowly. And probably other vulnerable people in their lives. Rosa nodded approvingly. Your gut is wise. I called Detective Santos the next morning and told her I wanted to proceed with both criminal and civil actions. The decision felt terrible, and necessary at the same time, like amputating a diseased limb to save the rest of the body. "I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Adams," she said. "But I think you're making the right choice. We'll need you to come in and make a formal statement, and there will be paperwork to file with the banks to report the unauthorized transactions." The process of filing charges against my own children was surreal and heartbreaking. I sat in a sterile police station conference room, dictating the details of their betrayal to a court reporter, watching my words become official accusations that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But as painful as it was, I also felt a strange sense of relief. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive about family dynamics or too demanding in my expectations. Now I knew that my instincts had been correct. Something had been very wrong with how my children were treating me. The worst part was the phone calls that began coming within hours of the charges being filed. Michael called first, his voice a mixture of panic and indignation. "Mom, what the hell are you doing? The police called me about some ridiculous fraud charges. This is insane." "Michael, I know what you did. I've seen the bank records, the transfers, the documentation. You stole over $100,000 from me while pretending to be worried about my safety." "We didn't steal anything. We were protecting your money while you were having some kind of breakdown in the desert. We were going to put it all back once you came to your senses." His words revealed so much about how he'd justified his actions. In his mind, my choice to build a new life in Death Valley was evidence of mental incompetence rather than personal growth. My decision to step back from my role as family caretaker was a breakdown rather than a breakthrough. "Michael, you filed a missing person report when you knew exactly where I was. You accessed my accounts without my permission while claiming I was incapacitated. That's theft and fraud regardless of your intentions." "Mom, please. We can work this out as a family. You don't need to involve the police. We'll return the money, and we can all move past this." But I was done being manipulated by promises and family loyalty. "If you wanted to work this out, as a family, you should have thought of that before you decided to rob me." Lisa's call came an hour later, and her approach was different but no less manipulative. "Mom, I can't believe you're doing this to us. Do you understand what criminal charges will do to our careers, our families? The kids will be devastated when they find out their grandmother is trying to send their parents to prison." "Lisa, I'm not trying to send anyone to prison. I'm holding you accountable for stealing from me. You made the choice to commit crimes. I'm just refusing to cover for you. We were trying to protect you. You were acting erratically, staying with strangers in the desert, refusing to come home. We thought you were being taken advantage of by those people out there." Her words revealed the depth of their misunderstanding about my new life. They couldn't conceive that I might be happier and healthier without their constant presence and management. They had convinced themselves that my independence was evidence of exploitation rather than empowerment. The calls continued over the following days, sometimes tearful, sometimes angry, sometimes attempting to negotiate. Sarah called to beg me to think about the grandchildren. Greg called to suggest family counseling. Even teenage Brandon called, clearly coached by his parents, to tell me how confused and hurt he was by my actions. Each conversation was painful, but they also reinforced my conviction that I was doing the right thing. None of my family members expressed genuine remorse for their actions. None of them acknowledged that they had violated my trust in the most fundamental way possible. They were all focused on the consequences they were facing rather than the harm they had caused. Rosa stood by me throughout the ordeal, offering quiet support and practical assistance as I navigated the legal proceedings. She never suggested that I should forgive and forget, never implied that family loyalty should override principles of right and wrong. "You're teaching them an important lesson," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the desert stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You're showing them that actions have consequences, even when those actions are committed by people you love." Frank also offered his support, sharing that he'd dealt with the private investigator who'd been asking questions about my mental state. "Told him you were the most clear-headed person I'd met in years," Frank said when he stopped. "By to check on me? Said anyone who could build the life you've built out here was obviously functioning just fine." His words meant more to me than he probably realized. After months of being told by my family that my choices were evidence of declining mental capacity, it was reassuring to hear from objective observers that I appeared to be thriving rather than deteriorating. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. Detective Santos kept me informed of developments, explaining that the evidence was strong and that my children's attorneys were likely to recommend plea agreements rather than risking trial. The U. Financial records are quite clear, she explained during one of our meetings, and the fact that they filed a false missing person report while simultaneously accessing your accounts creates a clear pattern of deceptive behavior. Meanwhile, I was discovering that the stolen money represented more than just financial loss. It represented years of careful saving and planning, resources I'd intended to use for my own care as I aged or to leave as a genuine inheritance for my children and grandchildren. The ironic thing, I told Rosa one afternoon as we worked together in her garden, is that they probably would have inherited most of that money eventually anyway. By stealing it now, they've forfeited any claim to my estate and destroyed our relationships permanently. Greed makes people do stupid things, Rosa observed. They got impatient and decided to take what they wanted instead of waiting for what they might have been given. As winter deepened in the desert, I found myself settling into a new kind of peace. The initial shock and betrayal were giving way to a clearer understanding of what my life could look like without the burden of toxic family relationships. The women in our support group rallied around me, offering both emotional support and practical assistance as I dealt with the legal proceedings. Margaret, the divorced woman in our group, helped me understand the emotional process of grieving relationships that couldn't be saved. Carmen, whose children had moved away, helped me see that geographic and emotional distance from family could be a form of self-protection rather than punishment. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we're supposed to love unconditionally, Beth, the retired teacher, observed during one of our meetings. But unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional abuse. Her words resonated deeply with me. I was learning to distinguish between loving my children as people and accepting their behavior toward me. I could wish them well, while also protecting myself from further harm. The holidays came and went without the usual stress of planning, elaborate celebrations, or coordinating complex family gatherings. Instead, I spent Christmas Day helping Rosa host a simple dinner for travelers who found themselves away from home, creating the kind of warm, inclusive celebration I'd always wanted but had never been able to achieve with my own family. On New Year's Eve, as Rosa and I sat by her fireplace with glasses of wine and a plate of homemade cookies, I reflected on the year that had transformed my life so completely. 12 months ago, I was a lonely widow trying to hold together a family that didn't really want to be held together, I said. Now I'm a business partner, a community organizer, and a woman who's learned to value herself independently of other people's approval. And don't forget, Rosa added with a smile, you're also someone who had the courage to hold her own children accountable when they betrayed her trust. That takes strength most people don't have. As the new year began, I received word from Detective Santos that my children had indeed accepted plea agreements. They would pay restitution, perform community service, and face probation, but they would avoid prison time. It was probably the best outcome I could have hoped for, holding them accountable while not completely destroying their futures. But I also knew that our relationships were permanently changed. The trust that had been broken couldn't be easily repaired, and the respect that had been lost might never be fully restored. I was learning to make peace with the possibility that some relationships, even family relationships, might not be salvageable. What I had gained, though, was a sense of my own worth that didn't depend on other people's validation or approval. I had learned to choose my own relationships based on mutual respect rather than biological obligation. I had discovered that it was possible to build a meaningful life at any age, in any place, with people who chose to love and support each other. The desert had indeed taught me what was important, but the lesson hadn't been what I'd expected when I first found myself stranded at Frank's gas station. I'd thought I was learning about survival and self-reliance. Instead, I'd learned about The difference between connection and control, between love and manipulation, between family that's chosen and family that's simply endured. As spring approached and brought new guests to Rosa's bed and breakfast, I realized that my story of abandonment had become a story of liberation. Being left behind had forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone else. And that person, it turned out, was someone I actually liked and respected. The bank accounts could be replenished. The legal proceedings would eventually conclude, and the pain of family betrayal would fade with time. But the person I'd become in the desert, the life I'd built from nothing but determination and the kindness of strangers, that was something no one could steal from me. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late March, delivered by certified mail to Rosa's bed and breakfast. The return address showed the law offices of Brennan, Martinez and Associates, and I recognized it immediately as Lisa's firm. My hands trembled slightly as I signed for the envelope, wondering what new legal complication my daughter might be introducing into our already strained relationship. Rosa was in town picking up supplies, so I sat alone at the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had taken place over the past 8 months. The legal proceedings had been concluded for nearly 2 months, with all parties fulfilling their obligations under the plea agreements. The stolen money had been returned to my accounts, though the legal fees and emotional costs could never be fully recovered. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of letterhead, folded around a cashier's check for $25,000. Lisa's handwriting covered both sides of the letter in the careful script I remembered from her childhood homework assignments. "Dear Mom," the letter began, "I know this money can't undo what we did to you, and I know an apology at this point might seem hollow or self-serving, but I need you to know that I've spent every day since our arrests thinking about how we betrayed your trust and violated everything you taught us about family loyalty and basic decency." I set the letter down for a moment, surprised by the directness of her words. Throughout the legal proceedings, Lisa and Michael had maintained that their actions were justified by concern for my welfare. This was the first time either of them had used the word betrayed to describe what they'd done. "I've been in therapy for the past 4 months," the letter continued, "trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could steal from her own mother. What I've learned about myself isn't flattering, but it's necessary. I was angry with you for changing, for becoming someone I didn't recognize or couldn't control. When you chose to stay in Death Valley instead of coming home with us, I felt abandoned and rejected. Instead of examining my own feelings and reactions, I convinced myself that you were the problem." Her words were painful to read, but they also carried a weight of genuine self-reflection that had been absent from our previous conversations. I continued reading, drawn despite myself into her account of the month since the arrests. The community service assignment opened my eyes to things I'd never considered before. I've been working with elderly clients at a legal aid clinic, helping them navigate financial abuse cases. Do you understand the irony, Mom? I'm now helping other people deal with exactly what I did to you. Every case reminds me of the terror and betrayal those victims must have felt when they discovered that their own families had stolen from them. I had to pause again, overwhelmed by the recognition that Lisa was describing the exact emotions I'd experienced when Detective Santos first showed me those bank records. The terror of discovering that the people you trusted most in the world had been systematically deceiving you. The betrayal of learning that concern and love had been weaponized against you. The check is from the sale of my engagement ring and some other jewelry that Dad gave me over the years. I know it doesn't represent the full emotional cost of what we did, but I wanted to give you something that had real value to me, something that represented sacrifice on my part rather than just repayment of what we stole. The gesture was both touching and painful. Lisa's engagement ring had been a family heirloom, passed down from Harold's grandmother, something I'd given her with great ceremony when she and Greg became engaged. That she was willing to sell it suggested a level of remorse I hadn't expected. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mom. I understand that trust, once broken the way we broke it, might never be fully repaired. But I hope you'll accept this money as evidence that I'm taking responsibility for my actions in the only way I know how. I hope you'll use it for something that brings you joy, something that has nothing to do with family obligations or guilt. The letter concluded with practical information about Greg's own efforts at restitution and updates about Brandon's adjustment to the family scandal. But it was the final paragraph that hit me most deeply. I want you to know that despite everything that's happened, I'm proud of the life you've built in Death Valley. It took enormous courage to start over at 73, and even more courage to hold us accountable when we betrayed you. You've become the kind of woman I hope I can be someday. Someone who values herself enough to demand respect, even from the people she loves most. I hope you're happy, Mom. You deserve happiness more than anyone I know. I sat with the letter for a long time, processing the complex emotions it stirred up. There was grief for the relationship we'd lost, anger at the circumstances that had made this letter necessary, and something that might have been the beginning of hope that healing was possible, even if it looked different than I'd once imagined. When Rosa returned from town, she found me still sitting at the table with the letter and check spread before me. "Good news or bad news?" she asked gently, setting down her packages and settling into the chair across from me. "Both, I think," I said, handing her the letter to read. Rosa read in silence, her expressions shifting as she took in Lisa's words. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully and looked at me with thoughtful eyes. "How does this make you feel?" she asked, in the direct way that had become one of the things I valued most about our friendship. "Confused," I admitted. "Sad. Maybe a little hopeful? I'm not sure forgiveness is possible, but this feels like the first genuine acknowledgement of what they did and why it was wrong." "What will you do with the money?" I'd been thinking about that question since reading Lisa's suggestion that I use it for something that brought me joy. The obvious answer was to add it to my savings or invest it conservatively, the kind of practical financial decision the old Janet would have made automatically. But the new Janet, the woman who'd learned to value her own happiness and pursue her own interests, had a different idea. "I think I want to expand the support group," I said slowly, the plan forming as I spoke. "Maybe rent a proper meeting space, bring in professional facilitators, create resources for women who are dealing with major life transitions. This money could fund something that actually helps people instead of just sitting in an account." Rosa's smile was warm and approving. "That sounds like exactly the kind of thing Lisa hoped you'd do with it. Something that has nothing to do with family obligations, and everything to do with what you've discovered about yourself." Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the project of creating what we decided to call the Desert Transitions Center. The $25,000 from Lisa, combined with some of my own savings, was enough to rent and renovate a small building in the nearest town, creating a welcoming space for workshops, support groups, and individual counseling sessions. Margaret, the divorced woman from our original group, had completed a certification program in peer counseling and agreed to help design our programming. Carmen used her background in education to develop workshops on practical life skills for women starting over. Beth, the retired teacher, created a library of resources on everything from financial planning to emotional healing. As word spread about the center, we began attracting women from across the region. Some were dealing with divorce or widowhood, others with career changes or empty nest syndrome. A few were facing family conflicts similar to what I'd experienced, learning to set boundaries with adult children or navigate complicated inheritance issues. Each woman who walked through our doors brought her own story of transition and challenge, but also her own strengths and insights to share with others. We were creating something I'd never experienced in my previous life, a community based on mutual support rather than obligation, connection rather than control. Frank became an unexpected ally in our work, referring travelers who stopped at his gas station and seemed to be dealing with more than just car trouble. He had a gift for recognizing when someone was running from something rather than just running to something, and several of our most dedicated participants had first heard about us through conversations at his counter. "You're doing important. Work out here," he told me during one of his visits to the center. "Lot of people think the desert is empty, but it's really full of folks who are trying to figure out how to start over. What you've built gives them a place to do that healing." As spring turned to summer, I found myself busier and more fulfilled than I'd been in decades. The combination of helping Rosa with the bed and breakfast, managing the transition center, and participating in the small but vibrant community we'd built around mutual support created a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. Most surprisingly, I was sleeping better than I had since Harold's death. The anxiety that had plagued me for years, the constant worry about whether I was doing enough for my family or whether they truly needed me, had virtually disappeared. I'd learned to distinguish between being needed and being valued, between love that demanded performance and love that simply accepted presence. In early June, I received another unexpected communication from Ohio. This time, it was a phone call from Michael, the first direct contact we'd had since the legal proceedings concluded. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant and unsure. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I wanted to let you know that Sarah and I have been going to counseling, trying to understand how we got so far off track with our priorities." I waited, not sure how to respond or what he was hoping to accomplish with this conversation. "I also wanted to tell you that we've seen some of the press coverage about your transition center. There was an article in a women's magazine about innovative support programs for older adults, and they featured your work prominently." I hadn't known about any press coverage, though I'd noticed an increase in inquiries from women who lived far from our physical location. The idea that our small desert program was being recognized on a national level was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. "Michael, why are you calling?" I asked gently. "What do you need from me?" There was a long pause, and I could hear him struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I guess I need to know if there's any possibility of rebuilding our relationship," he said finally. "Not going back to the way things were, because I understand now that wasn't healthy for any of us. But maybe finding a new way to be family that respects who you've become and who we're trying to become." His question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of complicated history and uncertain possibilities for the future. I thought about Lisa's letter, about the genuine remorse it had expressed, and the concrete actions she'd taken to demonstrate her commitment to change. "I don't know, Michael," I said honestly. "I'm not the same person I was when this all started, and I'm not interested in going backward. If you want to explore the possibility of a relationship, it would have to be based on complete honesty and mutual respect." "I understand that, Mom. And I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished out there. I was wrong to think you were having some kind of breakdown. You were actually having a breakthrough, finding the courage to build the life you really wanted." His words echoed what Lisa had written in her letter, suggesting that both of my children were beginning to understand that my choices had been about growth rather than decline, empowerment rather than confusion. "What would you want from a relationship with me?" I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. "Honestly, I'd like to get to know the person you've become instead of trying to make you go back to being the person you used to be. I'd like to learn from your example about how to prioritize what really matters. And I'd like the twins to know their grandmother as someone who had the courage to start over when life demanded it." We talked for another hour, carefully exploring the possibility of rebuilding connection on new terms. It was clear that both of us had changed significantly over the past year, and the people we'd become might be able to create a healthier relationship than the people we'd been before. But I was also clear about my boundaries. Any renewed relationship would have to be based on genuine choice rather than obligation. They would need to accept that I was no longer available to be the family organizer or problem solver, and they would have to understand that my life in Death Valley wasn't a temporary experiment but a permanent choice. I need to think about all of this, I told Michael before we ended the call. And I need to talk to some people whose judgment I trust. This isn't a decision I'll make quickly or lightly. Over the following days, I discussed Michael's call with Rosa, with the women in my support group, and with some of the new friends I'd made through the transition center. Their perspectives varied, but they all emphasized the same key points. Any decision had to be based on what I needed rather than what my children wanted, and I had to be prepared for the possibility that renewed contact might lead to renewed disappointment. The question isn't whether they've learned their lesson, Margaret pointed out during one of our conversations. The question is whether you're strong enough now to maintain your boundaries even when they test them. Because they will test them, probably without even realizing they're doing it. Her words resonated deeply. The old Janet had been so desperate for family connection that she'd sacrificed her own needs and boundaries to maintain relationships at any cost. The new Janet would have to be willing to walk away again if those relationships became toxic or manipulative. As summer progressed, I found myself more focused on the present than on past grievances or future possibilities. The transition center was thriving, with a waiting list for our residential workshops and inquiries about franchising our model in other locations. Rosa and I had officially formalized our business partnership, and I was learning aspects of hospitality and small business management that challenged me in unexpected ways. I was also discovering new interests and capabilities I'd never had time to explore during my years of family caretaking. I'd started taking art classes from a local painter who specialized in desert landscapes, finding unexpected joy in capturing the subtle colors and dramatic light of my adopted home. I'd joined a hiking group that explored remote areas of Death Valley, pushing my physical limits in ways that left me feeling accomplished and strong. Most importantly, I was building genuine friendships with people who knew nothing about my past except what I chose to share with them. These relationships were based on mutual interests and compatible personalities, rather than shared history or family obligation. They provided a kind of uncomplicated affection I'd forgotten was possible. In August, exactly 1 year after the events that had changed my life so dramatically, I decided to organize a celebration of the Transition Center's first anniversary. We planned a weekend retreat for all the women who'd participated in our programs, combining workshops with social activities and quiet reflection time. As I looked around at the gathering of 43 women from across the southwestern United States, all of whom had found the courage to rebuild their lives after major transitions, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with other people's approval or expectations. During the closing ceremony of the retreat, each participant was invited to share one insight they'd gained through their transition process. When my turn came, I found myself thinking about the gas station, where this journey had begun, about Frank's words regarding what the desert teaches you about importance. I learned that being abandoned can sometimes be the greatest gift you'll ever receive, I said, looking out at faces that reflected understanding and shared experience. I spent decades trying to hold together relationships that were already broken, trying to be everything to everyone except myself. Being left behind forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't performing those roles. After the retreat ended and the participants returned to their various homes, I sat in the quiet of the transition center, surrounded by testimonials and thank you notes that represented genuine appreciation for work that felt meaningful and valuable. Rosa found me there as the sun was setting, bringing 2 glasses of wine and settling into the chair beside me. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, raising her glass in a casual toast. "I was thinking about choices," I said, clinking my glass against hers. "A year ago, I thought my choices were limited to being the kind of mother and grandmother my family wanted or being alone and forgotten. I never imagined there was a third option, being the kind of person I wanted to be and finding people who appreciated that person." And now? Now I know that the people who really matter will love you for who you are, not for what you do for them. And the people who only love you for what you do for them aren't really loving you at all. As autumn approached, I received one final communication from my children, this time a joint letter from both Michael and Lisa. They were writing to inform me that they'd established a scholarship fund in Harold's name, focusing on supporting older adults who were pursuing education or starting new careers later in life. We know this doesn't erase what we did, the letter concluded, but we hope it represents our commitment to honoring the values you and Dad tried to teach us, even when we failed to live up to them ourselves. The gesture was thoughtful and appropriate, a way of channeling their guilt into something constructive rather than continuing to burden me with their need for forgiveness. I appreciated the fact that they weren't asking for anything in return, weren't using their good deed as leverage for renewed contact. I wrote back briefly, acknowledging their gesture and expressing hope that they were finding peace and purpose in their own lives, but I didn't extend an invitation for reunion or suggest that their actions had earned them a place back in my daily life. As the first anniversary of my arrival in Death Valley approached, I found myself reflecting on the woman I'd been when I first walked into Frank's gas station, desperate and abandoned, compared to the woman I'd become through a year of growth and challenge. The old Janet had defined herself entirely through her relationships to other people, had measured her worth by her usefulness to family members who tolerated rather than treasured her presence. She'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted crumbs of affection rather than demanding the full meal of genuine respect and appreciation. The new Janet had learned to value her own company, to pursue her own interests, to form relationships based on mutual choice rather than obligation. She'd discovered that being alone was not the same as being lonely, and that being loved was not the same as being needed. On the exact anniversary of the day my family drove away without me, I drove back to Frank's gas station for the first time since everything had changed. He was there behind the counter, looking exactly the same as he had a year earlier, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure when he saw me. "Well, if it isn't Janet Adams," he said, coming around the counter to give me a warm hug. "Look at you, all tan and healthy and happy. Desert life agrees with you." We talked for nearly an hour, catching up on the year's events and the changes we'd both witnessed. Frank told me about other travelers who'd found themselves in difficult circumstances and had been helped by the network of support Rosa and I had helped create. "You know what I think?" he said as I prepared to leave. "I think that day your family drove off was the best thing that ever happened to you. Sounds harsh, but sometimes people need to lose everything they think they want before they can find what they actually need." His words stayed with me as I drove back to Rosa's, back to the life I'd built from nothing but determination and the kindness of people who owed me nothing but chose to care anyway. That evening, as I sat in the sunrise room where I'd first begun to understand that being alone didn't mean being abandoned, I called my children for the first time since Michael's tentative outreach months earlier. "I want you both to know that I've forgiven you," I told them during our brief conference call. "Not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger was preventing me from fully embracing the life I've built." I explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean returning to previous patterns of relationship. But it did mean releasing the emotional weight of their betrayal so I could move forward without carrying that burden. "I wish you both well," I concluded. "I hope you've learned from this experience and that you'll make better choices in the future. But I want you to understand that my happiness no longer depends on having a relationship with you. If we reconnect, someday it will be because we choose each other, not because we're obligated to each other." As I hung up the phone, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The last threads connecting me to my old life of desperate family loyalty had been cut, not in anger, but in acceptance of what was and hope for what could be. Outside my window, the desert night was filled with stars that seemed closer and brighter than any I'd seen during my years in Ohio. The silence was complete and comforting, broken only by the occasional call of a coyote or the whisper of wind through the Joshua trees. I was exactly where I belonged, with people who chose to love me and work I found meaningful, and a future full of possibilities I was finally brave enough to pursue. The family who'd driven away without me had given me the greatest gift imaginable, the freedom to discover who Janet Adams really was when she stopped trying to be everything to everyone else. Death Valley had indeed come for their bank account, exposing their greed and forcing them to face consequences for their actions. But more importantly, Death Valley had come for my soul, stripping away everything unnecessary and revealing the strong, independent, valuable woman who'd been buried under years of self-doubt and desperate people-pleasing. I was 74 years old, and I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.